The tires made a soft, crunching sound on the fresh snow, the only noise in the muffled world outside our car. Inside, the heater hummed, pushing out air that smelled faintly of cinnamon from the scented pine cone I tucked into the vent. Mark's hand was warm on my thigh, a solid, reassuring weight. He squeezed gently. "Ready for this?" His voice was low, a rumble I felt more than heard. I tried to smile, but my lips felt tight. The truth was, I was never fully ready for the annual Sterling family Christmas party. It wasn't a party so much as a performance, and his mother, Eleanor, was the exacting director. "As I'll ever be," I murmured, watching the enormous, brilliantly lit house grow larger in the windshield. It stood on a hill overlooking the town, a monument to Sterling's success, each of its dozen windows glowing with a warm, golden light that promised cheer and welcome. But I knew better. That light was as carefully curated as the antique ornaments on the 20-foot Fraser fir I knew was standing in the great room. The warmth was a conditional thing, dependent on adhering to Eleanor's unspoken rules. We pulled into the circular driveway, already crowded with luxury cars gleaming under the floodlights. The air outside was bitingly cold when Mark opened my door, a sharp, clean scent of pine and frost that made my lungs ache. He took my hand, his palm calloused and familiar against my cold fingers. The front door was a massive oak thing, adorned with a wreath so perfectly constructed it looked artificial, though I knew Eleanor had it made fresh from imported holly and silver-dusted eucalyptus. Before our knuckles could even graze the wood, the door swung open. A wave of warmth and sound washed over us, a complex symphony of roasting turkey, mulled wine, a crackling fireplace, and the low, polite murmur of 24 conversations blending into a single, elegant hum. And at the center of it all was Eleanor. She stood framed in the doorway, a vision in emerald green silk that shimmered under the crystal chandelier in the foyer. Her silver hair was swept into a flawless chignon, and her smile was dazzling, but it never quite reached her cool, assessing blue eyes. "Darlings, you're here." Her voice was like polished silver, bright and crisp. She wrapped me in a hug that smelled of expensive perfume and hairspray, her embrace surprisingly firm, a gesture of possession more than affection. Her cheek was smooth and cool against mine. She held me a moment too long, her gaze flicking over my simple red dress. I felt a familiar prickle of inadequacy, the feeling that I was an amateur actor who had stumbled onto a professional stage. She released me and turned to her son. "Mark, darling. You look tired." It wasn't a question of concern, it was a criticism. Mark, bless him, just smiled and kissed her cheek. "Good to see you too, Mom." His father, Richard, appeared behind her. He was a tall, stooped man who seemed to have faded over the years, like a photograph left in the sun. His handshake was soft, his palms slightly damp, and his eyes, a paler, sadder version of his wife's, held a perpetually distant look. "Sarah. Good of you to come." He always said that, as if my attendance was a favor and not a requirement of my marriage. The foyer was breathtaking, of course. A grand staircase swept upwards, its banister wrapped in garlands of real pine and tied with velvet ribbons. The air was thick with the scent of money, old and new, and the weight of tradition. From the great room, I could hear the gentle strains of a string quartet playing carols, the sound almost drowned out by the polite clinking of glasses and silverware. We moved into the heart of the party. The great room was dominated by the enormous Christmas tree, twinkling with thousands of tiny white lights and hung with ornaments that were family heirlooms, each with a story Eleanor loved to tell. A fire roared in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the faces of people whose names I could never quite remember. They were business partners, old family friends, people who moved in the same rarefied air as the Sterlings. I took a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, the bubbles fizzing against my tongue, the liquid cold and sharp. Mark was immediately swallowed by the crowd, enveloped by uncles and cousins who slapped his back and asked about his latest project at the firm. I was left to drift on the periphery, a satellite in the Sterling solar system. I found Mark's sister, Jessica, hovering near the dessert table, her expression a familiar mix of boredom and resentment. Her dress was a little too tight, her makeup a little too heavy. She was the family's designated disappointment, a fact Eleanor never let her forget. "Sarah," she said, her voice husky from too many cigarettes. She popped a miniature cannoli into her mouth. "Surviving?" I gave her a small, conspiratorial smile. "Doing my best." "You?" She snorted, a very unsterling-like sound. "I'm 3 glasses of my mother's overpriced Chardonnay in. It's the only way to get through this." "God, look at her." Jessica nodded towards Eleanor, who was holding court by the fireplace, her laughter light and tinkling, a perfect social instrument. "She's in her element. The queen in her castle. Makes you want to puke, doesn't it?" I didn't answer, just took another sip of my champagne. With Jessica, silence was often the safest response. We stood for a moment, watching the flawless performance of the happy family. Richard stood beside his wife, a faint, noncommittal smile on his face, his hands clasped behind his back. Mark was talking to an elderly man with a booming laugh, his face animated and handsome in the firelight. It was a perfect picture, a Christmas card brought to life. But I could feel the tension humming just beneath the surface, a low-frequency vibration that set my teeth on edge. It was in the way Eleanor's smile tightened when Jessica reached for a second cannoli, the way Richard's eyes kept straying to the large bay window that looked out onto the dark, snowy landscape, as if he were looking for an escape. The evening wore on, a seamless procession of polite conversation, more champagne, and tiny, exquisite appetizers. The string quartet transitioned from Silent Night to Winter Wonderland. I talked to a woman about the challenges of finding good caterers and to a man about the stock market, nodding and smiling until my face ached. I felt Mark's hand on the small of my back, a brief, grounding touch. "You okay?" he whispered, his breath warm against my ear. I leaned into him, inhaling his familiar scent of soap and wool. "I'm fine. Just, you know." He nodded, his jaw tight. He knew. He lived it his whole life, this pressure to be perfect, to maintain the flawless facade. But for him, it was normal. For me, it was like trying to breathe underwater. He squeezed my waist. "Not much longer. We'll get through it." An hour later, dinner was announced. We all filed into the formal dining room, the long mahogany table gleaming under the light of 3 more chandeliers. It was set for 30, with bone china, sterling silver, and a centerpiece of blood-red roses and pine boughs that ran the length of the table. I found my place card, nestled between a distant cousin and Mark's Uncle Robert, a man whose only topic of conversation was golf. The scent in the room was overwhelming, a rich blend of roasted meat, garlic, herbs, and the cloying sweetness of the roses. The sounds of conversation rose again, louder now, fueled by alcohol and the forced intimacy of the dinner table. The staff moved silently, filling water glasses, pouring wine, their faces impassive. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, her posture ramrod straight, a benevolent monarch surveying her kingdom. Richard was at the opposite end, looking smaller and more lost than ever. The first course was served, a delicate butternut squash soup in a tiny porcelain bowl. I was lifting my spoon when the sound came. It was faint at first, barely audible over the chatter and the scrape of spoons against china. The doorbell. A long, clear chime that cut through the noise. A hush fell over the room. Everyone looked towards the head of the table. Eleanor's smile was frozen on her face. No one was expected. The guest list for this party was as fixed and unchangeable as the stars. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head to one of the servers standing near the door. The server, a young woman with a pale, nervous face, hesitated, then slipped out of the room. The conversation started up again, but they were strained now, quieter. Everyone was listening. I could hear the low murmur of voices from the foyer, the sound indistinct but carrying a note of tension. My stomach clenched. Something was wrong. The air in the room had shifted, grown heavy and thick. The dining room door opened again. The young server stood there, her hands twisting the white apron at her waist. Her eyes were wide. "Mrs. Sterling," she whispered, her voice trembling. There are some people here to see Mr. Sterling." Eleanor placed her spoon down with a delicate click. Her voice was ice. "We are not receiving guests. You know that. Tell them to leave." The girl swallowed hard. They won't leave, ma'am. They insist on speaking with Mr. Sterling." All eyes were on Richard now. He had gone completely still, his face a pale, waxy mask. He looked ancient. A muscle twitched in his jaw. "Who is it?" he asked, his voice a dry rasp. Before the server could answer, two figures appeared in the doorway behind her. The first was a young man, probably in his early 20s, with a nervous energy about him. He was dressed simply in a dark jacket and jeans. But it was the man beside him who drew every ounce of air from the room. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with a weathered face, kind eyes, and the same tall, slightly stooped frame as Richard. He had the same pale blue eyes, the same set of his jaw. The resemblance was so stark, so undeniable, it was like looking at a ghost. The man's gaze swept over the stunned faces at the table, a flicker of something, sadness, maybe, or regret, in his expression. His eyes finally landed on Richard, and they held. The silence in the room was absolute. It was so quiet I could hear the frantic, panicked thumping of my own heart against my ribs. I could hear the faint, crackling hiss of the candles in the centerpiece. The man took a hesitant step forward. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but it filled the cavernous silence. It was a gentle voice, with a slight, unplaceable accent. "Hello, Richard," he said. And then, the words that shattered the perfect Sterling world into a million pieces. "I'm Leo. I'm your son." The silence that followed Leo's words was a physical thing. It pressed in on us, heavy and suffocating, sucking the very air from my lungs. It was a silence deeper than any I had ever experienced, a void where the clinking of silver and the polite murmur of conversation had been just moments before. Every single person in that room was frozen, a tableau of shock and disbelief. Spoons hovered halfway to mouths, wine glasses were held motionless, and 30 pairs of eyes were fixed on the two men standing in the doorway, and the one man at the end of the table who looked as if he'd been turned to stone. Richard's face was utterly devoid of color. It was a ghastly, chalky white, his skin stretched taut over his cheekbones. His mouth was slightly open, as if he were trying to speak but had forgotten how. His hand, which had been resting on the table, was clenched into a fist, the knuckles white. Then Eleanor moved. It was a small, sharp movement, like a predator spotting its prey. She rose from her chair, her green silk dress rustling like dry leaves. Her face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. Her eyes, fixed on Leo, were like chips of ice. "How dare you," she said, her voice low and venomous, each word a perfectly enunciated drop of poison. "How dare you come into my home and tell such a disgusting lie?" She didn't look at her husband. Her focus was entirely on the man who was a living, breathing reflection of him. Leo didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, filled with a profound sadness. "It's not a lie," he said, his voice still quiet, but firm. He took another step into the room. The young man beside him, Alex, looked terrified, his eyes darting around at the horrified faces as if he wished the floor would swallow him whole. "Get out," Eleanor hissed. "Get out of my house this instant before I call the police." The threat hung in the air, vibrating with menace. But Leo didn't move. He looked past her, his eyes finding Richard's again. "I didn't come here for trouble," he said, his voice pleading now. "I didn't come for money. I wanted to meet you. I wanted to look my father in the eye. Just once." The word father landed like a physical blow. I saw Mark flinch beside me, his body going rigid. I reached for his hand under the table, and his fingers were ice cold, gripping mine with painful force. Jessica, across the table, was staring at Leo with a strange, unreadable expression on her face, a mixture of shock and something else, something that almost looked like recognition. No, that wasn't possible. Eleanor took a step forward, her body a rigid line of outrage. "Richard, tell this person to leave. Now." But Richard didn't seem to hear her. He was staring at Leo, his expression crumbling. The waxy mask of shock was cracking, and underneath was a raw, naked anguish. His eyes filled with tears, and one spilled over, tracing a slow, glistening path down his pale cheek. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the polished wood floor. The sound was a gunshot in the silence. He stood up, his body trembling. "Is it?" he whispered, his voice a hoarse, broken thing. "Is it really you?" Leo's face softened, the lines of tension easing. A small, sad smile touched his lips. He nodded. "It's me." That was it. That was the moment the facade of the perfect Sterling family didn't just crack, it exploded. Eleanor let out a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob of pure rage. "No," she cried, her voice finally breaking, losing its icy control and becoming shrill. "Richard, don't you dare. After everything I did, everything we did to protect this family." Her words hung in the air, a confession that condemned her more than any accusation. She knew. She had always known. The guests started to move then, a ripple of discomfort turning into a wave of panicked retreat. The spell was broken. They were no longer at an elegant Christmas party, they were witnesses to a family's public execution. The sound started to return, but they were all wrong. The scraping of chairs, the clatter of a dropped napkin ring, the frantic, hushed whispers. "We should go. My coat, where's my coat? Did you hear?" It was a scramble to escape the raw, exposed wound that had just been ripped open in the center of the room. Uncle Robert, the golf enthusiast, was the first to speak to us directly. He clapped a hand on Mark's shoulder, his face a mixture of pity and embarrassment. "Son, I think we'll be heading out. Call us, all right?" Mark just nodded, his face a blank mask. He hadn't said a word, hadn't moved a muscle except to tighten his grip on my hand. In less than 5 minutes, the dining room was empty, save for the family. The half-eaten soup grew cold on the bone china plates. The candles flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The string quartet had long since fallen silent. The only sound was the muffled slam of the front door as the last of the guests fled into the cold night. And then there were 7 of us. Me, Mark, Jessica, Eleanor, Richard, and the 2 strangers who had brought our world to a halt. The young man, Alex, finally spoke, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry. Leo's my neighbor. He told me the story. His mother, she passed away a few months ago. She left him a box of letters. From his father. From you." He looked at Richard, his expression pleading for understanding. "The letters had this address. He just wanted to know. I work for the catering company. I thought maybe if he came tonight, he could just see you. I never meant for this to happen." Eleanor rounded on him, her face contorted with a fury that was terrifying to behold. "You thought," she spat. "You worthless little boy, you have no idea what you've done." "Enough, Eleanor," Richard said. His voice was stronger now, infused with a lifetime of repressed emotion. He walked slowly, unsteadily, from the end of the table. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of Leo. He looked older, more fragile, standing next to this man who was his mirror image. He reached out a trembling hand, not quite touching Leo's face, his fingers hovering in the air just inches from his cheek. "Your mother," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Anna. Is she?" Leo shook his head slowly. "She died in October. It was peaceful. She talked about you. Right up to the end." Richard let out a choked sob, a sound of such profound grief that it seemed to tear through his body. He finally let his hand fall, placing it on Leo's shoulder. The contact was electric. It was a bridge across 50-some years of silence and secrets. Mark finally let go of my hand. He stood up, his chair making a quiet, controlled sound against the floor. He looked from his father to Leo, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. Confusion, anger, hurt, betrayal. Dad, he said, the single word a question that encompassed everything. What is going on? Eleanor answered for him, her voice dripping with scorn. What's going on, Mark, is that your father had a sordid little affair before we were married. This person is the result. A mistake. A mistake I have spent my entire life cleaning up. She wasn't a mistake, Richard said, his back still to his wife. I loved her. The words were quiet, but they had the force of a physical blow. Eleanor recoiled as if he had struck her. Her face, for the first time, showed not just anger, but a deep, gaping wound. It was the look of ultimate betrayal. Jessica, who had been watching the entire exchange with a kind of grim fascination, finally spoke. She pushed her chair back and stood up, a bitter smile on her lips. Well, she said, her voice laced with a dark, triumphant humor. The perfect family. What a joke. All this time, all these years of pretending, for this. She looked at Leo, a real, genuine smile finally reaching her eyes. So, I have a brother. She walked over and held out her hand. I'm Jessica. It's a real pleasure to meet you. Welcome to the circus. The moments that followed Jessica's sardonic welcome were a blur of fragmented sounds and images, all amplified in the cavernous, echoing silence of the dining room. Leo shook Jessica's hand, a look of genuine surprise and gratitude on his face. Richard was still clutching Leo's shoulder, as if he were afraid this man, this ghost from his past, would vanish if he let go. Eleanor stood frozen, her face a mask of incandescent rage and deep, profound hurt. Her perfect party, her perfect life, had been torched, and she was standing in the ashes, staring at the man who had lit the match, her own husband. Mark, my Mark, who was always so steady and centered, looked completely adrift. His eyes darted between his father, his mother, and the man who was supposedly his brother. His world had been tilted on its axis, and he was struggling to find his footing. A brother, he finally managed to say, his voice tight and strained. He looked at Richard, his expression pleading. Dad, is this true? All of it? Richard finally turned, his face etched with a guilt so profound it was painful to witness. He looked at his son, the one he had raised, the heir to the Sterling name. Yes, Mark, he said, his voice cracking. It's true. His name is Leo. He is my son. Mark staggered back a step, as if the words had a physical force. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of deep distress I knew so well. I don't understand. Why? Why would you? How could you keep this a secret for my entire life? Because it was necessary. Eleanor's voice sliced through the air, sharp and brittle. We had a life to build. A family to protect. Your father made a youthful indiscretion. It was handled. It was over. Leo turned to face her, his gentle expression hardening for the first time. Handled, he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. Is that what you call it? Sending my mother away with a check and a threat? Forcing her to sign papers giving up any claim? Forbidding him from ever contacting us? My mother lived her whole life looking over her shoulder. She loved him. And you erased us. His words painted a picture uglier than I could have imagined. This wasn't just a secret, it was a campaign of deliberate, cruel annihilation. The check, the threats, the forced silence, it all reeked of Eleanor's brand of ruthless control. I did what I had to do to protect my family, she insisted, her chin high, her eyes blazing with self-righteous fire. This family. Our family. Not some mistake from the past. The word mistake hung in the air, cruel and deliberate. Richard flinched, but it was Mark who reacted. Don't call him that, he said, his voice a low growl. It was the first time I had ever heard him use that tone with his mother. Eleanor looked at him, stunned into silence. Mark took a deep breath, the sound shuddering in his chest. He looked back and forth between his parents, his face a canvas of dawning, horrifying realization. All this time, he said, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and grief. Our whole lives. The pressure to be perfect, the holidays that had to be flawless, the report cards, the careers, was it all just this? A performance? A lie to cover this up? Jessica let out a short, harsh laugh. Bingo, she said, her arms crossed over her chest. Finally, he gets it. Our entire childhood was one big exercise in brand management. The Sterling Family, Incorporated. Perfect, prestigious, and completely fake. The tension in the room was unbearable. It felt like the air was turning to glass, ready to shatter. The young man, Alex, who had been standing silently by the door, began to back away slowly. I should go, he whispered, his face pale. I'm so sorry. No one stopped him. We heard his footsteps retreating through the foyer, the soft click of the front door opening and closing, and then, silence again. We were alone. The family, in all its fractured, broken glory. Richard finally let go of Leo's shoulder and turned to face his wife fully. The grief on his face was now mixed with a quiet, steely resolve I had never seen in him before. The faded, distant man was gone, replaced by someone with weight and substance. It wasn't a lie to me, Eleanor, he said, his voice trembling but clear. It was a prison. A beautiful, gilded prison you built for us. I stayed. I kept the secret. I did it for the children, for you. I thought it was the honorable thing to do. But I was wrong. The honorable thing would have been to fight for my son. He looked at Leo, his eyes overflowing with a lifetime of regret. I'm sorry, he whispered. I am so sorry. I was a coward. I let her scare me. Eleanor's face crumpled. The rage, the defiance, it all dissolved in an instant, leaving behind a raw, desperate vulnerability. I loved you, she choked out, her voice thick with tears. I loved you, and I knew you were in love with her. I couldn't start a marriage like that. I couldn't be second. I did what I had to do. It wasn't an apology, but it was a motive. A twisted, selfish, but deeply human motive. Her entire life, her entire identity, was built on being first, on being the best, on being Mrs. Richard Sterling. The existence of Leo and his mother was a threat to the very foundation of her world. Mark sank into a dining chair, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook. I went to him, my heels clicking softly on the floor. I knelt beside his chair and put my hand on his back, feeling the tense, knotted muscles beneath his suit jacket. I could feel the tremors running through him. He didn't look up, but he reached for my hand, his grip crushing. He was lost. His father was a stranger. His mother was a manipulator. His entire life was built on a foundation of lies. And somewhere across the room was a brother he never knew he had. Jessica, surprisingly, was the one who took charge. Her usual cynicism had been replaced by a strange, sharp clarity. Okay, she said, her voice cutting through the emotional haze. Screaming and crying isn't going to fix 50 years of this mess. We're all here now. What happens next? All eyes turned to her. It was a fair question. The bomb had gone off. Now we had to figure out how to navigate the rubble. Leo was the first to speak. He looked not at Eleanor or Jessica, but at Mark. I don't want anything, he said, his voice earnest. I have a life. A good one. I'm a carpenter. I have a daughter. She's 24. Her name is Anna, after my mother. He paused, letting that sink in. Richard had a granddaughter he had never met. I felt Mark's breath hitch beside me. I didn't come here to blow up your lives. I needed you to know I existed. And I needed to know who my father was. Now I know. He then turned to Richard. The letters, he said. My mother kept everyone you sent before they were stopped. They're how I knew you weren't a bad man. Just a man who was caught. Richard nodded, unable to speak, fresh tears tracking through the old ones on his cheeks. He had written letters. He had tried. That one small detail seemed to change everything. He hadn't just walked away. He had been forced away. The villain of the story was becoming clearer, and she was standing at the head of the table, wrapped in emerald silk. "We need to get out of this room," Jessica declared. "This place feels like a tomb." She walked over to the sideboard and poured herself a generous glass of brandy, her hand surprisingly steady. She looked at Leo. "You want one?" Leo managed a weak smile. "I think I could use one." She poured another and handed it to him. The two of them, the outcast daughter and the secret son, stood together, a strange and unexpected alliance formed in the wreckage. Eleanor watched them, her face a mixture of disgust and defeat. She looked utterly alone, abandoned by everyone. She had fought so hard to keep her family perfect, and in the end, her methods had only served to shatter it completely. Richard walked over to Mark and me. He placed a hand on his son's shaking shoulder. "Mark," he said, his voice thick. "I know this is a shock. We will talk. I will tell you everything. I promise." Mark finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and full of pain. He looked at his father, really looked at him, for what felt like the first time. He saw the regret, the weakness, but also the love. He didn't say anything. He just gave a slight, jerky nod. Then he stood up, pulling me with him. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine for an anchor in this storm. I squeezed his hand, trying to pour all the love and support I could into that one small gesture. He walked over to where Leo and Jessica were standing. He stopped a few feet away, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked at Leo, this man who shared his father's blood. He studied his face, the lines around his eyes, the set of his mouth. It was like he was trying to solve an impossible puzzle. "You're a carpenter?" Mark asked, his voice quiet. Leo nodded. "For 35 years. I build houses." Mark gave a humorless laugh. "My father always wanted me to be good with my hands. I never was. I went to law school instead." The irony was thick and bitter. The son he didn't know had followed a path Richard might have wished for the son he did know. A silence fell between them, not as heavy as before, but full of unspoken questions, of years lost, of a brotherhood that might have been. It was the beginning of something, though none of us knew what. A conversation. A relationship. Or just a quiet, painful acknowledgement of what could never be recovered. The perfect family was dead. And in its place, something new and terrifying and painfully real was starting to take its first breath. The hours that followed felt like a strange, surreal dream. The grand dining room, with its half-eaten meal congealing on the plates and its flickering candles burning low, was abandoned. Jessica's suggestion had been the right one. The space was too heavy with the ghosts of the party and the weight of the initial explosion. We retreated, not as a unified group, but as scattered, wounded individuals, to the library. It was a darker, more intimate room, filled with the scent of old paper, leather, and Richard's pipe tobacco, even though he hadn't smoked in years. A low fire crackled in the grate, a much more subdued and comforting sound than the roaring blaze in the great room. The thick velvet curtains were drawn against the cold night, cocooning us in our shared misery. Eleanor did not join us. After Richard's confession and Jessica's alliance with Leo, she had simply turned, her back ramrod straight, and walked out of the dining room. I heard her footsteps, sharp and measured, ascending the grand staircase. Then, the soft, definitive click of her bedroom door closing. It was a sound of finality, a retreat from a battle she had, for the first time in her life, lost completely. The rest of us settled into the library's deep leather chairs, a strange and fractured new family unit. Richard had sunk into his favorite wingback by the fire, his face buried in his hands. Leo sat on the edge of a stiff-backed sofa, nursing his brandy, his eyes constantly straying to the man who was his father. Jessica, surprisingly, had become the anchor. She refilled drinks, her movements efficient and devoid of her usual sarcastic flourish. She had a purpose now, something real to focus on beyond her own long-simmering resentments. Mark and I sat together on another sofa, a small island in the sea of tension. He was silent, his body radiating a tightly coiled energy. His leg bounced, a nervous rhythm against the floor. He stared into the fire, his jaw clenched, and I knew he was replaying his entire life in his head, re-examining every memory, every holiday, every maternal instruction to make the family proud, searching for the cracks he had never seen before. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the clink of a glass. It was Leo who finally broke it. "He's not a bad man," he said quietly, looking at Mark and Jessica. "Your father. The letters he wrote, he wanted to be in my life. He sent money, more than my mother would ever take. He tried to set up a trust. But it was all sent back. Everything was blocked. She was very thorough. He didn't need to say who she was. Eleanor's presence was a cold shadow in the room, even in her absence." Richard looked up, his face haggard in the firelight. "Her father had connections," he said, his voice raspy. "He was a powerful man. He made it very clear what would happen if I didn't walk away. Not just to me, but to Anna. To her family. They would have been ruined. I was 21 years old. I was a coward." Jessica snorted softly. "You were 21. You were a kid." She was the one who was 21 and already a calculating monster. "I'm guessing she ran straight to Granddaddy and had him do her dirty work." Richard didn't deny it. He just closed his eyes, a look of immense pain crossing his features. The story began to spill out then, not in a neat, linear narrative, but in broken pieces, offered up by Richard and Leo, filling in the vast, 50-year-old hole in their lives. Richard spoke of Anna, a girl he'd met the summer before his final year of college. A waitress in a small town where his family had a lake house. He spoke of a whirlwind romance, of a love that was pure and simple, free from the expectations and pressures of his own world. He spoke of the devastating moment she told him she was pregnant, a moment of both terror and a secret, profound joy. Then he spoke of telling his parents, and of telling Eleanor, the girl from the right family he was already unofficially engaged to. He described the cold, methodical way the two families had closed ranks, how his love for Anna was dismissed as a boyish fantasy, the baby an unacceptable complication. Leo, in turn, spoke of his mother. He described a woman who was sad but never bitter, a woman who had raised him with a fierce, protective love. He said she had kept a small, faded photograph of Richard in her bedside table her entire life. He spoke of growing up with a hole in his life, of watching other boys with their fathers, of a constant, dull ache of wondering. He told us about finding the box of letters after his mother passed, letters Richard had written in the first year of Leo's life, filled with anguish and love and promises he was never allowed to keep. He'd read them and realized his father wasn't the villain he had sometimes imagined, but another victim of the same ruthless machinery. Mark listened to all of this, his silence absolute. I could feel the conflict warring inside him. The son who loved his mother was being forced to see her as a cruel, calculating woman. The son who had always seen his father as weak and passive was now seeing him as a tragic, heartbroken young man. The world no longer made sense. When the stories finally trickled to a stop, the first hint of gray dawn was beginning to lighten the edges of the velvet curtains. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the room was growing cold. Exhaustion hung over us like a shroud. Jessica stood and stretched, her joints cracking in the quiet. "Well," she said, her voice rough with fatigue. "This has been the most honest Christmas in Sterling family history." Leo looked at Mark. "I should go," he said. "I've done what I came to do. Maybe more than I intended." Mark finally looked at him, his eyes filled with a deep, aching sadness. "Where will you go?" It was the first direct question he'd asked him. "I have a room at a motel in town," Leo said. "My flight back home is tomorrow afternoon." An awkward silence fell. The next step, the next move, was hanging in the air, a fragile, unformed thing. Richard struggled to his feet. "No," he said, his voice surprisingly firm. "You will not stay in a motel. You will stay here. In this house. In your father's house." It was a declaration. A line drawn in the sand. He was no longer asking for permission. Mark stood up then, too. He walked over to Leo, and for a moment, I thought he was going to yell, to tell him to leave, to reject this entire impossible situation. Instead, he just stood there, looking at the older brother he had never known. "He's right," Mark said, his voice quiet but steady. "You should stay." He extended a hand, the gesture stiff and formal, but a gesture nonetheless. "I'm Mark." Leo took his hand, his grip firm. Leo. And just like that, a fragile, tentative bridge was built between them. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't acceptance, not yet. But it was a beginning. The air in the room shifted again, a subtle release of the crushing tension. A path forward, however rocky and uncertain, was beginning to appear. Jessica watched them, a small, genuine smile on her face. Richard looked on, his expression one of immense, painful relief. I felt a surge of pride for my husband, for his ability to find a sliver of grace in the midst of all this pain. Richard turned to me. "Sarah, would you mind preparing the guest room? The blue one at the end of the hall." I nodded, my throat tight. "Of course." As I walked out of the library and up the grand, silent staircase, the first rays of Christmas morning sun were slanting through the high arched windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The house was still and quiet. But it was a different kind of quiet than the one that had met us at the door last night. That was the quiet of secrets, of things unsaid. This was the quiet of exhaustion, of catharsis. It was the quiet after the storm. I walked past Eleanor's closed door, a strange pang of something, pity, in my chest. She was in there, alone in her self-made prison of perfection, while downstairs, the family she had tried so hard to control was beginning to reshape itself into something new, something she would never be a part of in the same way again. I prepared the guest room, the motions automatic. I pulled back the heavy silk comforter, fluffed the pillows, and opened the curtains to let the morning light in. The room overlooked the back gardens, now a pristine, untouched blanket of white snow. It was a beautiful, peaceful scene. But I knew that for the family in this house, nothing would ever be so simple, or so pure, again. We had survived the night. But the day, and all the days to come, were another question entirely. The sun rose higher on Christmas morning, painting the snow-covered landscape in hues of pale pink and gold. The beauty of it felt like a cruel joke. Inside the Sterling mansion, the atmosphere was thick with the residue of the night's confessions. It was the quietest Christmas I had ever experienced. The usual traditions, the extravagant brunch, the ceremonial opening of perfectly wrapped presents under the giant tree, were unspokenly abandoned. The very idea of celebrating felt obscene. I came downstairs after a sleepless hour of lying in bed, listening to Mark's restless breathing beside me. I found Leo in the kitchen, a mug of coffee in his hands, staring out the window at the garden. He was dressed in the same simple clothes from the night before, and he looked out of place and utterly at home at the same time. He heard me enter and turned, a hesitant smile on his face. "Good morning," he said. His voice was warm, and in the clear light of day, the resemblance to Richard was even more pronounced. It was in the kindness around his eyes, a feature I realized had been scrubbed from Richard by years of living with Eleanor. "I hope you don't mind," he said, gesturing with his mug. "I figured out how to work the coffee machine." "Not at all," I said, trying to smile back. "Help yourself to anything." We stood in an awkward silence for a moment. "What do you say to your husband's secret, 50-something-year-old half-brother on Christmas morning? The etiquette books didn't cover this." "Thank you," he said, his voice soft. "For last night. You and your husband. You were kind." "He's a good man," I said, the words feeling trite but true. Mark's capacity for decency, even when his own world was imploding, was one of the things I loved most about him. Richard appeared in the doorway then. He had changed into a simple sweater and trousers, but he looked as if he had aged a decade overnight. His face was gray with exhaustion, but his eyes, when he looked at Leo, were clear. "I couldn't sleep," he said. He walked over to the coffee machine and poured himself a mug, his hand trembling slightly. He and Leo stood near each other, two men separated by a lifetime, the air between them charged with everything that had been left unsaid. It was a fragile, tender scene, and I felt like an intruder. I quietly made myself some toast and retreated to the library, leaving them alone. I found Jessica there, curled up in an armchair, scrolling through her phone. She looked up as I entered. "Merry freaking Christmas," she said, her voice dry, but without its usual bitter edge. "How are the long-lost father and son doing?" "They're in the kitchen," I said, sitting down. "It's quiet." She nodded. "It's going to be a lot of that, I think." She put her phone down. "You know, for years, I thought I was the problem. The screw-up. The reason Mom was always so wound up and disappointed. I never measured up. My grades weren't good enough, my boyfriends weren't rich enough, my life wasn't perfect enough." She looked at me, her eyes surprisingly clear. "Now I know. It was never about me. I was just a symptom. The real disease was the secret she was hiding. We were all just props in her stage play, and I was the one who kept missing my cues." It was the most insightful, self-aware thing I had ever heard her say. The night's events had cracked her open, too, letting some of the bitterness out and some of the truth in. Mark came in a few minutes later. He looked exhausted, his eyes shadowed. He came straight to me and sank onto the sofa, pulling me against his side. He wrapped his arms around me and just held me, burying his face in my hair. I could feel the tension thrumming through his body. "I talked to him," he whispered, his voice muffled. "To Leo. He told me about his daughter, Anna. She's a teacher. He showed me a picture. She has Dad's eyes." He pulled back to look at me, his own eyes swimming with a confusing mix of emotions. "I have a niece. A 24-year-old niece I've never met. I have a brother who builds houses with his bare hands. Everything I thought I knew, Sarah, it's all gone." "It's not all gone," I said softly, cupping his face in my hands. "You're still here. I'm still here. This is real." He leaned into my touch, closing his eyes. "What do we do now? What does this family even look like tomorrow?" That was the question hanging over the entire house. The answer, it turned out, came from upstairs. Around noon, we heard the sound. A suitcase. The distinct, rhythmic bump, bump, bump of wheels rolling across the hardwood floor of the upstairs hallway. We all fell silent, listening. The sound grew louder as it approached the top of the grand staircase. Then, she appeared. Eleanor. She was impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray traveling suit, her hair perfectly coiffed, her makeup flawless. She looked not like a woman whose life had just been shattered, but like one who was embarking on a planned and orderly trip. She held the handle of a sleek, expensive suitcase. She descended the stairs with a slow, deliberate grace, her face a mask of cold composure. She didn't look at any of us. Not at Richard, who stood frozen in the library doorway. Not at Jessica or Mark. And especially not at Leo, who had followed the sound and was now standing in the foyer, looking on in stunned silence. Eleanor reached the bottom of the stairs. She set her suitcase down with a soft click. She pulled on a pair of leather gloves, her movements precise and unhurried. Only then did she finally look at her husband. "I have called my lawyer," she said, her voice devoid of all emotion. "He will be in touch with yours. I will be staying at the club until my flight to Palm Beach this evening. My things will be sent for." Richard stared at her, his face ashen. "Eleanor, don't do this. We can talk." She gave a short, sharp, humorless laugh. "Talk? You had 55 years to talk, Richard. You chose your moment. And now I am choosing mine." Her eyes swept over the rest of us, a look of utter contempt on her face. "You have made your choice. You have chosen this." She gestured vaguely in Leo's direction, as if he were a piece of distasteful furniture. "You can have it. You can have this broken, pathetic, sentimental mess. I am done. I am done cleaning up after you. I am done pretending. She turned to Mark and Jessica. I hope you're happy. You finally destroyed the family I gave everything to build. Without another word, she turned and walked to the front door. She opened it, and a blast of cold, clean winter air filled the foyer. She stepped out, pulling her suitcase behind her. She did not look back. The door clicked shut behind her, the sound echoing in the sudden, profound silence. She was gone. Just like that. The queen had abdicated her throne, leaving her kingdom in ruins. The finality of it was stunning. Richard stumbled back a step, leaning against the doorframe for support. He looked utterly broken. The strength he had found the night before had evaporated, leaving him hollowed out. Jessica, for all her bravado, looked pale and shaken. Mark's face was a mask of grief. Whatever his mother had done, she was still his mother. This was a brutal, cold amputation. I went to Richard and put a hand on his arm. His skin was cold as ice. Richard, I said gently. He just shook his head, his eyes vacant. She's gone. Leo stood awkwardly to the side, looking profoundly uncomfortable. I should not have come, he said, his voice filled with guilt. This is my fault. Mark turned to him, his expression hardening slightly. No, he said, his voice firm. This is not your fault. This was her choice. The secret was the problem. Not you. You were just the truth. It was a moment of stunning clarity, of Mark choosing his new reality, choosing to place the blame where it truly belonged. He walked over to his father. Dad. Let's go sit down. He and Jessica gently guided their father back into the library, leaving me and Leo alone in the vast, empty foyer. The house felt enormous now, hollowed out, its heart ripped away. Leo looked at me, his eyes full of sorrow. I never wanted to cause so much pain. You didn't cause it, I told him, echoing Mark's words. You just revealed it. It was already there, festering under the surface. Maybe this was the only way it could ever be healed. I wasn't sure if I believed it, but I said it anyway. For him, and for myself. The perfect sterling Christmas was over. The holiday was ruined. A marriage of 55 years was over. A family was fractured beyond recognition. But as I looked at this quiet, decent man who had been denied his family for his entire life, I felt a flicker of something that wasn't despair. It was a tiny, fragile spark of hope. The lie was over. And now, in the wreckage, we could finally, for the first time, begin to build something real.